Hello and welcome to the Drill Down, where we investigate cronyism and corruption in Washington, D.C. and the federal government. I am Eric Eggers. Normally, Peter Schweizer is the first voice you hear because this is the Drill Down with Peter Schweizer after all. Peter Schweizer is away, and so in his place, we are excited to be joined by somebody who is no less an expert at government waste and abuse than Peter Schweizer. I'm joined by Andrew McClenahan. Now, when I say he's an expert in government waste and abuse, my man is literally the Intergovernmental Committee co-chair for something called the United Council on Welfare Fraud. And you and I have spoken at conferences together. You have literally spent your career investigating fraud in taxpayer-funded welfare programs. So we're excited to have you on because we're having this moment as a country where we're talking about what it looks like to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. And you have been recognized nationally as an expert in fraud. So, Andy, welcome to the Drill Down.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I want to point out before we begin that since you are replacing Peter for all intents and purposes on today's podcast, we're actually setting a couple records. If you're watching on video, you can see, number one, we have more facial hair than we've ever had on any episode of the Drill Down. We also have way fewer books sold. And so we're on both ends of the spectrum this way. But Andy, you and I were speaking because you actually were in Washington, D.C. when the first DOGE hearing occurred. So you were in the room, and we'll put up on screen. You were in the background there. Your boss, right. Don Royal, was one of the three people that testified, along with the people for the Foundation for Government Accountability and the other gentleman who, for lack of a better way to describe him, was blind. And so he was the Democrat representative on fraud. He was the visually impaired person. But the fact that we're even holding hearings like that, and you have Republicans in charge of Congress and Republicans in charge of the White House, what does it tell you about what we actually might be able to do in terms of tackling the elimination of fraudulent spending in government?
Well, I mean, it's the first time since, I believe, 1996 under the Clinton administration that there was any reform that was done in any of the public assistance programs. There's been a lack of attention to any of these things, sort of pushing it to the side. And since then, I think things have kind of jumped the rails. The shark has jumped the script, so to speak.
This is why we don't let you in charge of metaphors, Andy. And it's okay. You're in charge of fraud. You have your own lane of expertise. We'll do the coloring, okay? Got it. But it is a really important thing that we're doing. Elon Musk is the news yet again today because of all the government programs. We've been through the USAID. We've talked about the EPA spending and the money going to Stacey Abrams. And then the pushback has gotten, and this is how you know they're being effective, because we no longer are trying to defend money for trans programs in Algeria or, right. Green energy things that go to people that have no experience administering these programs that are tied to the Obama administration. Now they're saying, well, yeah, but any of those eliminations, they're not going to actually make a dent in what our federal spending is. And they're not going to actually help us accomplish this goal of eliminating $1 trillion in savings if we're actually going to get, the federal debt under control, as Elon Musk has stated his aim is. And so this week, Elon Musk said, okay, well, we have to take a look at the bigger aspects of the program. Elon Musk says that entitlement spending is the vast majority of what our government spending is. And so we're talking about Social Security, we're talking about Medicare, Medicaid, and EBT and SNAP programs. And that's the latter of which is your area of expertise. Elon Musk cited the stat. He said, look, that's, $500 billion, maybe $600 billion, maybe $700 billion. According to the Government Accountability Office's own figures, they would say that there's anywhere from $230 billion to $520 billion in fraudulent payments in those programs across the board. So the money is there if it's going to be looked at. What I think is really important to note, and this is the area of your expertise, because you come from looking at welfare spending, SNAP, EBT fraud, and it occurred to me as we were talking that this is how different the conversation is. So the conversation is so different that now we have somebody that Donald Trump has elevated to highlight government spending and fraudulent uses of taxpayer dollars. Before, Andy, when you, as you were employed to do, were in charge of saying, hey, here's some examples of really bad fraud, not only did the government deny it, the government rewarded states with financial incentives who also denied it, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of the whole problem here is that there was not just a deny perspective, but the government was rewarding. In fact, until the 2018 Farm Bill and SNAP, states would receive a bonus for expanding the program and getting more recipients onto public assistance and getting away from the whole acronym of supplemental.
So think about that, right? And that's important context, because when we go through some of these numbers, as we're going to do, we're going to talk about what the estimates are for Social Security fraud, for Medicaid fraud, for Medicare fraud, and the wasteful spending. Remember that the incentives have been not just to not expose the totality of it, but to actively deny it, because at least in the welfare system, the states that report the lowest error rate get the most money as reward. So that's where it's been, and that's part of the system. That's part of the inertia that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are attempting to change. And so actually, to that point, Andy, when you and I were talking before we started recording this, I told you that some of the stats that they're citing, they would say the national Medicaid improper payment rates are estimated to be 5% for 2024, which would be $31 billion. And your initial reaction to that was what?
It's probably a factor of 6x times that.
So try that for anybody that speaks English.
You're probably looking closer to 27%, I believe, is the payment error rate just in the Medicaid program.
So how does that happen, right? How can we have that big of a discrepancy in terms of what the government's saying their error rate is in the Medicaid program versus what it actually is?
Well, you can't quantify what you don't count. I mean, that is a fundamental weakness in conversations that when people are asking how much fraud is there in the program, especially when you've got conflicting interests. For example, in Medicaid, with the expansion into the Affordable Care Act, states were given a 100% funding rate from the federal government to expand Medicaid to people who were not normally eligible for that. The current payment rate is still at about 90%, where the federal government is footing the bill for the states on the expansion of both Medicaid. And the same problem was clearly evident in the SNAP program as well.
Yeah, and we're going to get into some of those examples. But I think what we want to start with, because this is what Elon Musk has talked about this week. By the way, the Medicare fraud rate is, again, at the lower levels, it's estimated to be $60 billion. And so if that's being underreported in the same way that Medicaid is, I mean, we're talking about real numbers. If you're saying that it's off by a factor of 6, then that puts Medicaid at $180 billion, that puts Medicare at $360 billion. And so, these are the numbers that Elon Musk has access to. And now all of a sudden, the $1 trillion mark of eliminating wasteful spending becomes actually quite attainable. And so that's just perspective for you as a listener to consider as they're having this conversation. And that's not the conversation, by the way, that the media is wanting you to have, because Elon Musk has mentioned now this week that Social Security is on, if not the chopping block, it's at least under the microscope. They've said, the Social Security Administration has said they're going to eliminate 7,000 of the 57,000 workforce, and they're going to close 6 of the 10 regional offices. And there's some other things they're going to do with Social Security, but I want to and we're going to start with Social Security, because Social Security is in some way the front door to the suite of other entitlement programs that we all pay for. And Andy sees it on the back end, because you see it on the welfare and the food stamp part of it. But Andy, your boss, Don Royal, testified about something called self-attestation. And what is that? And what does it have to do with Social Security? And then how does it then impact all these other welfare programs downstream?
Wow, that's a great question. It's loaded, too. How much time we have?
Yeah, let's just keep it moving, bro.
All right. So first, self-attestation, or what some people have called self-certification, is how the government is verifying people's both our identity and their eligibility for government assistance programs, which means they're working off of the honor system. If you say that you have 5 people living in your household, then we're not going to question that. If you say that you are not employed, you're not making any money, or you don't have any assets or resources in the bank, we're just going to accept your word for those things as well. And to close the loop on the Medicaid question that you mentioned, December 5th, 2024. CMS Administrator Daniel Tsai wrote a memo to states threatening them that they could not prosecute Medicaid beneficiaries for fraud, not to kick them out of the program, not to recover the waste, fraud, and abuse.
And by the way, December 5th, 2024 would have been in the last days of the Biden administration.
That's correct.
And unlike some of the other things that came out of the Biden administration, that was actually from an administrator, not auto-penned.
Correct. Okay, I'll take that
as
fact. So you have the federal government telling states and then threatening to withhold that federal FMAP money for the states on funding these programs. And so it's not just deny. It's hide the true numbers.
Which again speaks to the incentives that, just like in the welfare program, right? We're going to actively deny, we're going to hide because we don't want to sort of admit that we are overseeing programs that are as rife with fraud and abuse as we are. And that's what it's been. Okay, so back to self-attestation and how it impacts who's eligible for these programs.
So that's where it comes down to is self-attestation is another form of making sure that you're able to get as many people on assistance and dependency on the government and taxpayer funded programs as possible without any kind of eligibility verifications or identifying if somebody is even a resident of this country.
So put it another way, if people say they're eligible for Social Security benefits, you're saying that they basically become eligible for Social Security benefits and we don't do any due diligence to verify that they are.
Correct. And where that really runs into a problem is when you talk about the Social Security Administration. So the Social Security Act is what defines means-tested programs, including SNAP, Medicaid, HUD, all the factors that come into eligibility for some of these things. Now, some of them, the eligibility verifications, such as assets, have not been redefined since 1989. There's still $2,000 limit, so that hasn't been updated for the cost of inflation. However, the SSA, if they are accepting self-attestation, for example, for the SSI program, you're looking at eligibility that's going to impact other programs. If somebody becomes eligible for SSI based off of SSA's determination, then they're going to literally automatically qualify for other programs such as Medicaid or SNAP. So the fraud, waste, and abuse that impacts the first program, that first gateway government assistance program, transfers and increases exponentially the fraud, waste, and abuse as it impacts those other programs.
Is it fair to compare it to, like, let's say it's like a mall, right? Where like everything's free inside the mall. And rather than having any kind of security guard at the front door of the mall, with self-attestation, or let's just call it self-declaration because it's maybe an easier word to understand, anybody that says they're able to come in can come in and just kind of help themselves to what's available in the mall. Is that accurate or is that too simplified?
No, I think that's pretty simple. I haven't been set foot in the mall since Amazon came out, but then
we get it. You fair. Got your blazer from a boutique store. We okay, flex. So I think that's the point, right? Is that this, and when you say it becomes downstream, there's no verification. People can declare that they're eligible for things like Social Security benefits, which then it qualifies them for Medicaid, Medicare, and welfare. And so that's how you end up with all these people who shouldn't be eligible who now are receiving benefits. And you've seen some extreme examples of that. And we're going to talk about a couple of those extreme examples. But first, before we do that, I wrote a book on voter fraud, and one of the things that I think is similar there is like you have the roster of voter rolls, and everyone recognizes there's lots of problems with the names on these voter rolls, and some of them are people who are deceased, and where you run into problems, and you see the stories about you have more registered voters than legal citizens of voting age because these voter rolls don't get regularly maintained. In fact, also similar to the welfare program, not only are they not actively maintained, there are forces that actively fight you to maintain them, right, to keep you from maintaining them. And so it's kind of the same thing here. And they use the same, you have these kind of weak and elderly people who aren't able to do these things for themselves. So you have to have some vulnerabilities so people can help get the least of these access to whatever services, including voting. Now, where it comes to you is you talked about the death master file for Social Security. What is that, and what did Elon Musk say about that recently?
So I think that we've all heard about the 20 million people that are that were alive during the Civil War that are still marked as alive in the Social Security Administration's death master file, or the DMF. Now, not to pick on that administration, but the death master file has known problems, and it's been one that's been largely cited due to the lack of identity verification, data information that they use on there. The government is not the best source of data, believe it or not. And it takes time to get stuff from a local state health department to the federal administration. Now, the issue there is again, you're talking about the expanded and increased vulnerability and risks to improper payments or fraud, when the fact that people could be marked as alive. So the use of people's Social Security numbers, you'll see a lot of these people, the argument is that, well, they're not really dead, they're still paying on taxes. Well, some of those are non-citizens of this country that are using a deceased or stolen Social Security number, and so that they can pay taxes and they can be gainfully employed, they'll use that stolen Social Security number. So again, it impacts the eligibility for these other programs and increases the exposure to taxpayer resources.
And the fact that you have 20 million names on this Social Security list whose birth dates would suggest that they should be deceased, and it may just be a default, and that if you don't have the term, then the system may default to make it your birth date 1800 or 1900 or something like that. We've seen that in a lot of different databases before, but it's an example of a lack of precision, which makes the system more eligible for abuse, in your opinion.
It sounds like a Y2K problem that we still have 24 years later.
Well, just to give the Social Security Administration a little bit of a break, you're a soccer fan, I'm a soccer fan. I just saw the story recently, and I think it just underscores how tough it can be to keep track of whether or not somebody is actually living or dead. I know you follow the Premier League. You're a Tottenham fan. I don't follow a lot of
shame me.
I don't follow a lot of Bulgarian soccer, but just on Sunday, a Bulgarian soccer team called PFC Arda had a moment of silence for a former player named 𝐃𝐫𝐢𝐥𝐥, and everybody kind of lined up and they bowed their heads and to pay a tribute to this guy. Well, it turned out the guy was actually still alive. And so they had to admit on social media before the game was even over, they said, hey, we wish 𝐃𝐫𝐢𝐥𝐥 many more years of good health and enjoy the success of Arda. So it isn't just the Social Security Administration that has a hard time keeping track of whether or not people are actually alive or dead. It's a problem that it's, in fact, international and worldwide. So because these errors exist, then you see real numbers of waste, fraud, and abuse start to pile up. The Government Accountability Institute has suggested it's hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud for Social Security. And then because you get in the front door that way, then you become eligible for EBT, fraud, and SNAP. Now, that's your area of expertise. And so you personally were involved in maybe the largest individual bust of welfare fraud that's ever occurred in the state of Florida, if not nationally, and that occurred at a flea market.
Yeah, that's right. The Opa-locka flea market, and you've reported about this back in, what was it, 2017 or 18 when you released the EBT terrorism article. So essentially, the Reader's Digest version is that there was about $100 million just in Florida recipient losses of fraud trafficked at a flea market in South Florida where there was no food. The only food that was on display is essentially your plastic Thanksgiving decorations at the center table that grandma uses were on display. No real food being purchased here, but the money was exchanged for cash, guns, drugs, human trafficking, including what we believe to be child sex for EBT. Now, that was a problem that was essentially the federal lack of retailer vetting that was passed on to the states. And I've used this expression before, and it's a friend of mine said it's the federal government dumping their trash on the state's lawn and then complaining about the smell. They don't have the authority to vet Social Security numbers in the retailer program. And so right now there's about 260,000 retailers across the country that are not vetted properly by the U.S. government. Now, you mentioned Bulgaria, but the Romanians are the actual stars of the show when it comes to fraud. You've heard about the EBT skimming and the account takeovers that are occurring with people as well. That problem that we're currently facing with the fraud of real people's benefits, we first saw back in 2017 and earlier in the state of Florida, because there was a lack of information and even knowing where the point-of-sale devices are. We saw people running in and throwing the little swipe card machines in dumpsters. Well, I think it was last week or last month, the Romanian secret police were raiding residents in the state of in the country of Romania, recovering EBT cards and point-of-sale devices.
Which ultimately means that in the country of Romania, they're pilfering money that should have gone to needy families in the state of California. And so when you talk about the scope of waste, fraud, and abuse, It seems silly that money that's meant to go to Californians ends up in Romania, but that's how vulnerable the system is. And just to go back to what you said earlier, if there are people who are in charge of administering and ensuring like the integrity of the welfare system who aren't allowed to ask for a social security number verification for people whose job it is to then be part of those transactions, I mean, that's just how broken the system is. It reminds me, actually, again, going back to election integrity, you got people who work at the DMV whose job it is to take the applications of voter registration, and they're not allowed to ask by law if somebody who's turning in a voter registration form is a citizen. They have to just take their word for it. So self-attestation is baked into the system. It's one of the reasons why you see, I think, fraud exist in so many different things. And it's why you end up with crazy stories like, we've documented before the story of in Minnesota, that trial's actually happening right now. It's not a U.S. Department of Agriculture program. It's actually through the Minnesota Department of Education with funds that come from the National Department of Education, at least while it still exists. But $250 million fraudulently sent to these nonprofits in Minnesota. They're a part of the Somali network. That got exposed because a wedding video was leaked onto Facebook that showed a woman who worked for one of these nonprofits getting a wedding gift with a cart laden with gold. I mean, and this program went from having like 3 million one year to 17 million another year to 140 million. And the federal officials and the state officials whose job it is to oversee these programs see that, and they don't get suspicious. They say, oh man, look at how well that program is working.
That's right.
And that happened during COVID, and COVID, when these emergencies happen, we sort of throw all the safeguards out the door. But it seems like we never go back and put them back in place. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a very fair assessment. I think your analogy about the fraud that's occurring in these other countries is a direct result of the old antiquated rules and regulations that we have around every single one of our programs. And you can point directly back to the Social Security Act and means tested and what that really actually means, along with the modernization and digitization of the rest of the globe and the world as it catches up with people having access online. And because we have a lack of controls here, the fraud, waste, and abuse is absolutely out of control. And it's no longer a local issue where you have somebody coming and sitting down in front of you and they show you their physical driver's license. It's remote online applications, and it's essentially an open door for everyone in the world now to apply.
So as we sort of wrap this up and get our minds and hands around the totality of this issue, Andy, I just want to sort of underscore, because you're going to see the headlines, you're going to see that Elon Musk and Donald Trump are coming for Social Security, and the White House has been very clear, like, no, they're not. Everyone who's supposed to receive Social Security benefits will continue to receive them, but they are, for the first time, going to take a hard and real look at just how much fraud may be happening there. And the point is that if what's happening in Social Security is like what's been happening in other programs, and this is where Andy's an expert, programs administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, not only has the amount of fraud been actively suppressed, we've been lied to about how successful those programs are. And so every number you see about how much fraud exists in Medicare and Medicaid is probably inaccurate, which means the likelihood of success for Elon Musk and Donald Trump is actually really good, because there's a lot more there that people have been unwilling to not just look at, but unwilling to let others look at. And that's just how it's been. And so, Andy, if there's good news that we want to leave people with besides that, is that you're involved in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and you believe that the new Department of Agriculture Secretary is taking a very different look at not just fraud, but then the mechanisms by which that fraud will be investigated and eliminated.
I think that's a very fair statement. I think that for the first time that improper payments, fraud, waste, and abuse is a number one priority for an administration. That's something that I haven't seen. The whole adage about having the staffing to address these issues, the not expanding the benefits, having basic identity verifications. I mean, currently, when it comes to the food stamp program, because of the antiquated rules, all you're required to have to apply for expedited benefits is a name, address, and a signature. So John Doe, homeless with an X, now states have to process and issue those benefits. And the the larger problem is clearly a lack of resources. Our welfare fraud investigators around the country who work both at the county and the state levels are grossly undermanned. And the reason why is because we've been hiding it, saying that the fraud is less than 1%. Now, by regulations, you're only required to have a part-time employee that works on fraud every once in a while. There's a catchment area that says that you only have to have a fraud investigator for every 5,000 households in an area, but it allows the states to define an area. So you have a major problem with the antiquated regulations, no incentives to stop fraud, waste, and abuse at the front end prior to the issuance of benefits. And then we're still stuck in this pay and chase methodology of trying to go and recover funds after they left the door. Good luck getting that in Romania, China, or North Korea.
So that's actually where I think that the staffing cuts in closing, I think, are positive, because people say, oh, that means there's fewer people to administer the benefits and it's going to be harder to make sure my grandmother gets the check or whatever it is. But what it also means is that we're sort of pausing everything, as they've done in every other program, just like they did in USAID. Hey, they're going to make sure the essential payments get made. But to the extent that you have so many erroneous payments going out the door, you use the phrase pay and chase. So it sounds like what they're attempting to do is sort of pause and examine and ensure accuracy on the front end before they then have to go chase it. And so I think that is just like a fundamental paradigm shift that they're attempting to perform. The headlines now are about cuts to Social Security benefits, but what we actually believe is that true intention, and I think the action, the stats back it up, is a real effort to cut benefit and entitlement fraud. And there's lots of it out there, way more than you've ever been told. So Andy McClenahan, you've been terrific to join and share your expertise. You've testified at a national level. You've been there on the front end of congressional testimony. And so I think this is a conversation that is massive and needs to happen. And we've just gotten a small glimpse into what the totality of fraud in these entitlement programs actually is at the federal level. We will continue to follow this story. We told you about the Minnesota fraud several years ago. That trial is happening right now. And as more examples of waste, fraud, and abuse come up, we will, of course, be here to document it every step of the way. Peter Schweizer's not here. He will be back next week. He was Andy McClenahan. I'm Eric Eggers. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of The Drill Down. If you continue to listen to and subscribe to this podcast, please drop us a review. Tell us, give us any feedback you like on social media. We always love to hear from you. If you have ideas for what you'd like to see on the show, we welcome that feedback, and we look forward to talking to you next week wherever fine podcasts are found.